excited to introduce the SIOP CARMA Introductory Reviewer Development Workshop series. So this is our third panel today. This is a part of a broader training that's being organized by CARMA and SIOP together. It's targeted at those with limited to no experience with reviewing, but is also a wonderful refresher even for those like myself who have been reviewing for quite some time to help remind us about some of the best practices with reviewing. So we've had, again, two panels so far. In total, we're covering 9 reviewer development competencies. Each has lasted for about 45 minutes. All 3 panels will, the recording are being recorded, and those recordings will be made available in the days to come. I would like to give a big thanks again to SIOP and the Education and Training Committee and some of the other SIOP committees for helping to organize and advertise the event, as well as CARMA for the help with organizing, scheduling, and handling much of the logistics. And I'd also like to give a very big thank you to our panelists who are taking time out of their busy schedule to share a lot of their experiences. We have a very distinguished panel with experience, lots of experience reviewing, as well as serving as associate editors and editor-in-chiefs. And especially appreciate their flexibility because these panels are international. We have folks joining us from around the world, which means some of the panelists joined very late at night and others very early in the morning. So again, a big thank you for that. So our third and final panel, we have Ernest O'Boyle from Indiana University, Fred Oswald from Rice University, and Tina Koehler, who's joining us from University of Melbourne. Yep, thank you, Tina. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity to open things up. I'd like to encourage audience members. We've had some great questions from the first 2 panels. I'd like to encourage folks to continue to send questions. I've gotten most of the questions so far from the chat function in Zoom, so feel free to use that. I've also said that if you want to, you can send me questions via email. My email is gbanks3@uncc.edu. And what we'll do is towards the end, I'll jot down some notes about some of the themes that are emerging in terms of questions, and I'll read those questions to the panelists and give them an opportunity to provide some insight for you all. Okay? So that being said, I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our wonderful third panel here.
Who did you want to go first, George?
You're welcome to. Would you like to go first?
Okay, somebody had to ask the question, right? All right. So my job is to talk about expertise and the role of expertise in the review process. So I think that's probably the thing that when most people start reviewing, they think about first. So in terms of lending their expert eye to the paper that they have to review. Now, there are a couple of points I wanted to talk about in terms of how you evaluate the quality of a particular piece, and also, of course, its relevance for the journal that you're looking at. So most of us, I think, look for things like the relevance of the topic for the larger research context, but also the importance of the paper for ongoing research and potentially its novelty. So you got to ask yourself some question as you're reading through a manuscript. Is the paper going to advance the current research, right? So, I mean, you got to be aware of the current status of the research, so where the debate's at, where the discussion's at, to understand whether or not the paper that you're reviewing actually contributes to that discussion and what it contributes to that discussion. And so a good paper should generate some debate around a particular topic, or maybe resolve a debate that's currently going on, just generally kind of bring us forward in the discussions that are ongoing. Other papers may advance our understanding of the phenomenon that's at the core of the paper, or they may advance our theorizing about that particular phenomenon. So those are all good contributions that papers can make. Another another contribution may be actually testing a phenomenon with a much advanced research method. So we're not as often talking about, for example, empirical contributions as we're talking about theoretical contributions, but those are of course also very important. So sometimes a paper may just test an existing phenomenon or an existing relationship or whatever by introducing a much more advanced method, and by doing that, introducing us to something about the phenomenon that we might not have understood correctly so far. So it's all about basically what is the paper contributing above and beyond that we currently know or that we currently do, and whether or not that contribution is important. So that's part of the assessment. Now, we hear a lot about novelty. So a lot of people talk about, whether or not a manuscript introduces something novel. Now, we all kind of look for stuff, I guess, when we read that we haven't known yet, that's something that is interesting to us or surprising or whatever. But there's a bit of danger in looking for novelty in everything that we read, because it just kind of encourages authors maybe to look for the kind of findings that are a bit extreme, or the kind of findings that are out of the normal. And so that can also mean that the findings that we're highlighting may be unrepresentative or non-representative for the phenomenon that we're looking at. So just novel or just surprising isn't what we're looking for. We're looking for valuable contributions to the knowledge that currently exists in the field. So that's kind of, I think, the first thing that you evaluate for a manuscript. The other thing you got to evaluate is whether or not the premise on which the paper is built is appropriate. And so that means, for example, if the literature review that the authors have delivered is convincing and comprehensive, that there's nothing missing that would maybe shift the way that the authors treated the topic in a certain direction. So you got to look at whether or not the premise of the paper is appropriate and is valuable basically for the phenomenon that you're looking at. With that comes that the logic of the paper also needs to be appropriate. So the paper has to have a logic. It shouldn't contradict itself already in the literature review. The arguments should be solid. They should be backed up by, of course, the literature that's already out there, and they should be convincing, right? So if the arguments aren't convincing you, then clearly something is not quite right, maybe in the writing or in the evidence that the authors provide to back up their arguments. So when you look at the literature review, look at basically whether or not the authors are capturing the literature that's important for that particular topic, whether or not maybe the way that they cover the literature is either biased or just favors one perspective when there are other perspectives out there. So look at basically what may be missing from the literature review and whether or not that affects how the authors are building their hypotheses. So then finally you get to kind of the method section. So you have to look at whether or not there is a good fit between what the author set out to do and what the methods actually can deliver. So the chosen methods, of course, should fit both the research question, but also the general topic area. So, I mean, you want to make sure that the research design supports addressing the research question. You want to make sure that the methods per se that are chosen, data collection, sampling, data analysis, all of that, are actually in line with what the authors are trying to do and will deliver an answer to the research question that they set out to address. And then, of course, you want to look at maybe, are these methods that they suggested employed appropriately? So are they standards in the field, current best practices? Do the authors transparently disclose what they've been doing so that we understand exactly how the data have come about? And that gives us as reviewers, of course, an insight into whether or not we know whether the data can answer the research question, but also whether or not we trust the data, right? We trust basically whether or not the data provides a rigorous test of the research question that the author set out to do. So those are, in general, basically the areas of expertise that we're looking for in reviewers. So what reviewers should judge in a manuscript that they have. There's a little bit also that comes in for quality of the manuscript, so clarity in writing, assessing whether or not the manuscript is likely going to survive the review process, so whether or not the problems that you see are such big obstacles that you don't think that the paper really will come through the review process successfully, of course you make a judgment based on those aspects as well. But the main judgments that you make are about the paper's overall line of argument and whether or not the methods fit that line of argument. So I might leave it as that, and then we can discuss more later.
Great. Ernest or Fred, would either of you like to go next?
I don't want to close this thing. I'm going to leave it up to Fred.
Okay.
So the module that I'm representing is the represent module. And I just wanted to give a few ideas. There's a common theme that runs through them I'll come back to, but essentially the initial part of it, once you click that agree button to review a manuscript, you're entering into what amounts to a contract with the editor and the authors to represent the best interest of the journal. And when authors have a good or a bad experience with that particular contract, they're going to attribute it to the journal. You should know that they're not saying I had a bad experience with a reviewer at so-and-so journal. They're saying I had a bad experience at Journal of Management or whatever, Psych Methods, whatever it may be. So whether the feedback was constructive or pedantic, whether the tone was civil or aggressive, along those sorts of things, that all reflects back on the journal. So in terms of representing, you want to put the best face as possible on that journal. When I think back, and I actually looked at some of my very, very old reviews, and besides being terrible reviews, I noticed a couple themes that I want to point out that hopefully you don't fall into the traps that I fell into, which is my first reviews weren't at AMJ or JAP or places like that. They were at journals that I wasn't that familiar with. And I found one, it was for, hopefully I'm not talking about school, it was for group and organizational management. Group and organization management, and most of my review was centered on the fact of why didn't you control for individual differences? It's a groups journal. It's not supposed to control. That's just not the primary focus of that particular journal. So what I would recommend is if you're reviewing for a journal you're not that familiar with, actually go to the mission and scope of the journal. It's right there on the front page of the website. Look over some recent publications. Look at the table of contents of some recent issues that they have, even to the point of going through their editorial board and say, wow, everybody here is very, very micro. That's important to know that this is the type of editorial board that this journal is selecting, and presuming that's the type of manuscripts that they're syncing. Or, these are all the big names in the resource-based view. So perhaps, I understand why it's being emphasized so strongly in this manuscript. So I guess my next point here would be that regardless of whether you feel warm or cool to a general content area, leadership research, you either really like it or it's not your thing, take into consideration you're serving as a segment of that journal's audience. So a substantial segment, even if you don't find that a particularly exciting topic, a large chunk of that journal's audience may still. So just to dismiss something out of hand because it doesn't excite you really isn't representing the journal the way that they probably hope that you are. The next point is that you can absolutely be critical in the review without giving an overall recommendation to the authors. This paper should be rejected, or this should have never even been sent out for peer review, that sort of thing. Those aren't constructive. The author's obviously not going to want to hear that. And quite frankly, the editor doesn't want to hear that. That hamstrings them. It's clear that we have this one reviewer that feels so strongly about it that they're willing to put that recommendation in the response to the authors. That's not where it goes. You can save all that for the other editor. There's always a box, comments to the editor. And if you want to vent at that point, go for it. But, we're used to hearing that sort of stuff. But it's really not, from a tone standpoint, from a professionalism standpoint, it doesn't go into the comments to the authors. I struggled with this one a little bit, but I want to encourage you to consider this point, which is that your review has the potential to set precedent at a journal. And what I mean by that is when something actually makes it through the peer review process, it's almost like the law. Like you can, other authors will start to cite that. So if it's something, and I don't mean to pick on it, but if the Myers-Briggs test, if you say that's a valid personality measure and it makes it through the peer review process at, the journal I rep, Journal of Management, that kind of is something now that other authors and other manuscripts will say, other studies have shown that the MBTI is something that works in these sorts of settings before. So really take a lot of time to consider that you have that power. You are in a very powerful position as a gatekeeper of what gets in and what does not. The next point I have is it's kind of harkens back to the thing I said before, be candid with the editor about a paper's viability. So whether or not you think it's going to be able to make it through the peer review process. You can be candid there also about the level of contribution. And then the last one, which is kind of a touchy topic, and Tina mentioned it somewhat, which is the robustness of findings. If it's 100 individuals nested within 15 teams and they found a three-way interaction that crosses levels of analysis and the figures all came out perfect just the way that it was all predicted before, you can kind of mention that, wow, it's not a question of research ethics or hearkening or any of that stuff. It's simply a question of, I don't know how robust these sorts of findings are. And again, that's a comment to the editor necessarily. And then the last thing, if a manuscript fails to fit the journal's mission and you're going to point that out to, I think that, again, that's something to mention to the editor that, hey, this reads so much like a psych methods piece. I don't think it's a great fit here at ORM or whatever it may be. So that's, in terms of the represent module, the few things I want to say.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Fred, you're up next.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? There was a little bit of cut in and out there at the end there. Are we good?
I'm hearing
all right. Okay, excellent. Well, I don't know how much more I have to add on top of my colleagues, but my area is efficiency, so maybe that's a good thing. I will try and live up to being efficient. I guess first I'll say, hey, thanks for joining us. We're so glad to join you all and hope you get something out of this. Look forward to the discussion that we'll have time for here. Let me be quick. I guess the point I'm supposed to make here that complements what's already been shared in terms of reviewer wisdom is the notion of efficiency. And we can think about efficiency in a few different ways. One is that simply that your time is precious. You do have to make time to do something else, like get tenure or, you might be a practitioner, you have paid work. So in that sense, you really are doing a service to the field, right? You're committing your time, you're committing yourself on something that isn't even your work. And so that's great. We're very appreciative. I know I've learned a lot from reviewers over time, and they didn't have to share those lessons with me, but they did. So that's a great thing about our community. Another part of efficiency is the other side of the room. Like you've got your own precious time, but guess what? So do editors and authors. They don't have much time either. So, and you're only a small part of the picture. There are other reviewers giving their perspectives, their editors sharing their wisdom and integrating comments and ultimately, giving their own decision and impression, which may or may not agree with yours. So how do you want to plug into that system, given your own expertise and the issues you see in the paper? You should probably prioritize and hit the high points. I know, like Ernest, I was an Ernest reviewer when I started out, and I wanted to show that I cared, I guess at one level. Maybe I wanted to show how smart I was, or that I noticed everything. But that's really not the goal of a review, right? I mean, ultimately, as much as I'd like everyone to read and appreciate everything I have to say, you got to narrow it down. And so what are your goals? Well, the goal is to, ultimately the editor has to make a decision to accept or reject or usually many papers are revise and resubmit and benefit from reviewer comments as the paper iterates. As a reviewer, I'd say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. In other words, don't go in maybe like I did, where I pointed everything out in the paper, and ultimately you think everything should be rejected, nothing is perfect, except maybe your own work. That's not the attitude to have, is to say, what are the good aspects of this paper? And, there's an old saying that editors' jobs is, their job is to rescue papers where reviewers have shot them down. And your job's not to be an editor either, but your job is to kind of weigh in with your expertise as part of a bigger picture, like I said before, in terms of efficiency. And so point out the major good points. Don't forget to be constructive and say what's good and how this is contributing, but then also lend that critical voice that's going to make a paper better. I will say it is true. I have faith in the review process. It's not perfect, but it has made my papers better, for sure. Sometimes it's painful, but it definitely has made papers better. And ultimately, as an author, you decide, right? You decide on what you want to do with reviewer comments. Sometimes it means you take it to another journal. Sometimes it doesn't. So help the authors, point out fundamental flaws. Don't worry too much about specific ones unless they really irk you. Offer alternative analyses, perhaps, but don't be too esoteric. I mean, if they result in the same practical conclusion, you might ask whether those alternative analyses are needed. You could suggest new directions. I'd recommend not being too lofty. Try and make it really connected as a direct extension to the work, because every paper is part of a larger conversation. So try to keep it practical. And anything to help the authors. Your job is not to rewrite the author's paper, but in terms of improving readability and impact, how can you help? What's unclear, point it out. You might say this is an example of a larger problem. Try to be clearer, or maybe it is a smaller thing. But sometimes the same information can be very not impactful written out as text, and be very impactful when it's tabled or something like that. So anything you have in terms of how the information might be reframed to make it more readable and impactful, that can really be helpful. And then a third goal as a reviewer. So the first one was help make a decision. The second one is help authors with the paper in specific ways. And the third one is related to those past two, and that's to serve science. You really are serving science in the broader conversation. And I'll close by saying, when I try to be efficient as a reviewer, I tend to, when I get a paper, read the tables and figures first, kind of the meat of what the paper is trying to say concisely. Then I go to the methods and the results sections, what's going on in the kitchen in terms of a study. And then I go into the intro to see if that links up with what was operationalized in terms of methods, right? We're all prone to our extensions of what we actually did in the introduction and the discussion, right? We have, you hear the phrase, more theory is needed. Well, how's the theory connected to what you did in the kitchen? So I read the intro next and then the discussion. Again, don't rewrite the paper. You don't have to write an extensive review, just be efficient. And I hope this was helpful. I mean, no review is going to cover every issue, so prioritize ones that reflect your expertise, and always keep the author in mind and helping them out, and you're helping the editor to make a decision as well. Ultimately, it's the editor's decision, but you need to figure out what's the most important information to relay. So, thanks.
Great. So we've had some questions come through that I will direct to the panelists here in just a minute. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you all the opportunity in case Tina or Ernest or Fred want to make any additional comments regarding any of the other points that the other panelists have made. All right.
Well, I'll say something. I might as well. I find reviewing to be fun, believe it or not. I like knowing what's current in the field. I like connecting the dots between ideas. And, you know, people have various profiles for what they like and don't like. And, you know, I would say review as much as you have an appetite for. There's some level of fairness, right? That if you're going to publish in our journals, you probably should review for our journals as well. I'll leave it at that.
Well, okay, yeah. So Fred, this actually relates to some of the questions that came through. How much should you be reviewing for conferences and for journals? Like what's I think the questions that kind of how many reviews should you be kind of doing in total? I realize it's, you know, it looks like an abstract question, but.
Well,
I think Tina, yeah.
Maybe I'll take that on. Well, I mean, I think there are multiple ways to approach this. So if you think about just the math here, for every paper that you submit to a journal or to a conference, that paper gets 2 to 3 reviewers for your paper. So theoretically, if the math works, because it's a peer review system, for every paper you submit somewhere, you should be reviewing 2 or 3, right? So just to make actually the system work. So that's just a basic math. But of course, people at different stages, you know, learning reviewing also means that at a point you get faster in your reviews. You know, once you have a bigger area of expertise, content expertise, methods expertise that you can draw from, you see potential challenges with the manuscript faster. You can also write them down faster. Like you can pinpoint, for example, suggestions for improvements much faster. So that also means that some of us probably take less time reviewing than somebody who is very early in their career. So we don't want to overload people who are very early in their career, where they potentially also have to submit a lot more papers by the pure math that I just kind of pointed out. So I think early on, you try and start reviewing for conferences. If you submit to a conference, you should be reviewing for that conference. I think that's just good citizenship. If you start submitting to a journal, maybe they will send you something. That'll take a while until they send you something from their end. But if you get invited to do that, over time, your review requests will go up. And then it becomes a question of, you know, balancing your learning that you can still get from that. As Fred said, a lot of people like reviewing because they can stay current. Other people like it because they actually learn a lot about writing and about, you know, crafting manuscripts and crafting, for example, response letters back to the reviewers. So also look at your learning that you're getting out of this. And then it's a really good way to actually learn about journals where you want to submit. So if you review for journals where you yourself want to submit, you learn something about what the readership of the journal appreciates, what the reviewers appreciate, what the editor is looking for. So it can be a really good way of actually learning about a journal that you want to submit. So that's what I would say in terms of how much, but you noticed I didn't give you like a magic number. That really kind of depends on how much you have capacity and how much actually matters to you and helps you.
Yeah, and I would agree. I don't have a number either, so sorry if that's what you were looking for on that front. It's but I will point out, and I guess this is on both Fred and Tina's comments here. It's the part of service that has the highest payoff. It really is, more so than any committee that your college is going to put you on or anything like that. It really is the amount of service that has way more carrots than sticks to it. No, you don't want to be spending 3 days a week reviewing manuscripts, but at the same time, if you do want to stay current on the literature, if you do want to know how to negotiate with an editor and with reviewers, well, it's better if you're going to get sent a lot of papers from people that are more senior, more experienced than you are, especially initially. You can start to see, oh, I don't have to acquiesce to every single reviewer demand. I need to handle it this way. There's this other tone that comes in a response letter. This is what reviewers may like to see or what they don't like to see. You really learn how to become way more efficient in the process to, I mean, I don't know if there's any numbers on it, but the idea of getting your batting average up, that once you get extended that first R&R, to be able to close that out, a lot of that success, a lot of what drives that number up is going to be your experience as a reviewer. So,
great, thank you. Okay, so the next question, I think this one was directed more towards Tina, but you know, Fred and Ernest, feel free to chime in. When evaluating a paper's contribution to a field, to what extent should you take into consideration the same or similar contribution being published in a different field? So maybe me adding some additional context, if you see a contribution being published in the management IO space, to what extent should you consider that same related contribution, either theoretical or methodological, being published maybe in like a sociology journal or a general psychology journal?
Well, I think, look, I think a literature review, especially a comprehensive one, should actually look beyond just the psychology and management disciplines, especially if it sounds like a topic is really quite similarly treated in those other disciplines. Now, oftentimes we see that other disciplines treat topics quite differently. They use different theoretical lenses. They use different epistemologies, ontologies. So in that sense, you got to evaluate whether or not the way that it's treated elsewhere is actually comparable to the way it's treated in management. So this, you should read elsewhere. That's the main message here, and you should involve that in your reasoning if it makes sense because it's in the similar tradition. Now, at the same time, a contribution, like publishing a contribution in management that may have been made elsewhere, can be entirely reasonable if it's not, if it's not part of the current discussions and debates that we have in management. So quite a few articles may focus on introducing debates that other disciplines have into management and introducing it to a wider audience to maybe enrich the discussions that we do have in management. That can be entirely appropriate. It depends really on, kind of where you want to move the discussion that we currently have in our field.
Great. Anything else, Ernest or Fred, want to add? Otherwise, I can go on to the next question. Good. Okay. All right. So next one, this one says, when you have a criticism of non-robust findings that you mentioned to the AE and the AE doesn't take action or respond either to you or the authors, what's the appropriate course of action as a reviewer?
Ultimately, it is the AE's call on that. Maybe those findings are robust. I mean, there's a subjectivity to every review. No, it's your job if you have concerns about it to raise that. But I will never look at this manuscript again because I don't trust these findings and I don't care whether you do or not. I don't think that's a very good position to take. You're in an advisory role. You advise the AE and the AE decided that that information, took it to heart, but at the same time didn't reject the manuscript or maybe even didn't bring it up to the authors. That's the AE's prerogative, in my opinion.
Right, Tina, you agree with that perspective? Tina nodding.
So
yeah. I mean, there's not much to say. I think Ernest is absolutely right. I mean, the reviewers and the editors have different roles, right? So in that sense, the AE is really the person who has to make that call. Sometimes as an AE, because the concerns of the reviewer are in that reviewer's letter. So the authors will get those concerns. And maybe the AE wants to give the author that chance to actually respond to those comments, right? So, I mean, just because the AE may let a manuscript go forward doesn't automatically mean that they're going to accept it in the end. Maybe they just want to give the authors an opportunity to actually react to those comments, maybe provide more data, etc. So, just because you suggest a rejection, for example, as a reviewer, doesn't necessarily result in a rejection on the associate editor side, because, they may have a different point of view, and it's just about giving a chance. Otherwise, we wouldn't actually be engaging in a debate here. We would be engaging just in some sort of evaluation with the final judgment every single time. And I think that wouldn't be conducive to the research process.
I think my own reaction is the devil is in the details as well, as far as robustness, how to react to it as a reviewer, and how that plugs into the larger decision about a paper. So, for example, what if the issue was, the sample size was 6, okay? And you say, well, a correlation based on n = 6 is not very helpful at all. Well, how's that going to be handled? Well, the authors could apologize for that and say we need larger samples. The authors could collect additional data to make sure it's statistically stable. The authors could add more information and say, well, look, I have 6 astronauts. They work at NASA. I don't have any other people of this nature. I need to look at them. And so, have them build a case somehow involving data and other external information to promote. So in other words, the concern about robustness should be expressed by all means. I mean, Ernest and Tine both are saying this. And in terms of reviewers should express everything that's on their minds. And then it's up to the editors and the editorial process to figure out what to do with that. And then, of course, you can write your own rebuttal later and get yourself published. Just kidding, maybe.
Great. Well, those were all the questions that came through. So we can go ahead and conclude things. Just very briefly, is there anything else that you guys want to add? You guys have said a lot of wonderful insight so far. But if there are any final thoughts you want to throw out there, now's the time.
I just want to add my thanks. Thanks for having me. This was great. Really glad to talk with Ernest and Tine here, and glad for all of you joining us. That's really it. And as Tine said, and actually Ernest looked at a different angle, you do learn a lot as a reviewer. You get better, you get faster at it, and you grow your own muscles as a researcher. As much as you're helping others, you're also helping yourself. So, all right, thanks.
Yep. And I just wanted to echo similar sentiments. I think personally for me, reviewing has just opened a whole lot of new insights into how to form arguments, why certain arguments don't work, why others work. That just improved my writing tremendously. So I would not want to miss that part. The other part is, so I also coincidentally do some research into why people review. And apart from all the things that we just mentioned, the cognitive kind of aspects of it, the learning and whatever else, quite a few people actually also do it because they feel connected to the academic community. They feel that it's an important part of who they are as a scholar. It gives something back in terms of, doing something for your colleagues, even if you don't immediately know who they are. So there's also an emotional connection, I think, that we get from reviewing, and just in terms of contributing to good science and contributing to a good academic community that values kind of positive feedback, developmental feedback, and generally increasing, what we can do around the globe. So, and I think my plug is also for, get involved in reviewing when you can, and really kind of cherish the opportunities that you get, because they will help you a lot on a lot of different levels. But thanks a lot for everybody for attending and for giving us a chance to introduce reviewing to you.
Hey, I want to add, invite other people to review as well. Just going back to Tina's point about the math of all this, invite a couple other people tonight or morning, wherever you are.
Great, thank you.
Fred, we have to pay attention that this is not becoming a pyramid scheme of some sort, and we'll get outlawed here.
Yeah, absolutely. Just ditto what everybody else has been saying. There's such a benefit to this. There's a special feeling that you get when a paper that you reviewed is published. It's a really cool thing to be able to see that, and to see where, you saw that the authors might have been zigging towards a bad place, and you helped them zag back towards a better place. That's a good feeling. And as you get more and further in the field, your own individual glory means less and less. And it's more about, I want to make a difference. I want this field to have a real impact on both other academics as well as practitioners. We're in applied science. So thank you. So, the fact that you're here watching 9 speakers on reviewing, it heartens me to know that there's this kind of interest in doing a better job in such a crucial part of our business.
Great. Right, so a big thank you again to Ernest, Tina, and Fred for joining us today. Again, the recordings for all 3 panels will be posted and available so that you can also encourage other people to come watch and take advantage of the training opportunities being offered by SIOP and CARMA. So thank you again, everyone.
And thank you, George.
Oh,
thank you, George, for organizing all of this and pulling it all together.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, George.
Good collaboration.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a good evening and morning, everyone.